What's going on, guys? TG or ThunderGod here, and today I am talking about Itachi versus Obito. I know you've seen this video. You're like, how many more videos do we need? Listen, we trust in us. We got some, maybe some good stuff for you today. With me, I have Cameron. Go ahead and say hi.
Hi, I also make Naruto content. I've been on the channel a couple times. It's nice to be back.
Yep. And for anybody who doesn't know, me and Cameron are all the part of the reason we're doing this video is we're also doing Obito versus Pain on his channel. I don't know if it's gonna be up at the time of this video, but it will be up sometime after. So definitely go subscribe to Cameron just so you could just peep our thoughts on when that video drops as well on his side. So we're kind of doing one for each of our channels type of deal. So yeah, with that being said, we can just get straight into the discussion. But not before a word from our sponsor. Surfshark VPN. VPN, for those who don't know, is a virtual private network. Surfshark lets you stay private and secure during your day-to-day activities. Surfshark has developed humanized privacy and security solutions to safeguard your data and privacy online. Now, while this is all well and good, you probably want some application from Surfshark. This is where it can come in, as it can help you watch blocked platforms such as Netflix or other content from other countries. I myself use it for Netflix Japan to watch shows such as Blue Lock or Dandadan, the most popping anime out right now, so you'll definitely not want to miss out on this. Surfshark even offers a 30-day money-back guarantee policy, so there's absolutely no risk to you trying it out. Click the link in the description at surfshark.com/thundergod for 4 extra months of Surfshark. Make sure to check it out today, guys. So starting off with this discussion, I think it's important to just discuss really briefly the narratives revolving around Obito and Itachi. Do you wanna take the lead on this?
Yeah, so from the manga itself, the biggest narrative surrounding how Itachi compares to Obito is the infamous statement where Obito says that, like, now Itachi is dead, I can now move to attack the Leaf Village and capture Naruto. And a lot of people just take that at face value. Okay, that means that Itachi was preventing Obito from going to the Leaf Village. Therefore, Itachi might be stronger than Obito. And while I wouldn't say that's a horrible interpretation, it doesn't necessarily check out. Just because we know that, especially after getting slammed by Minato, Obito was very cautious about how he went about getting the Jinchuriki, and Itachi could be a threat to him. Like, I think it is acknowledged throughout the series. It's not like Itachi's no problem for Obito to deal with. So just to be cautious, it's possible that Obito just waited for Itachi to die for him to attack the Leaf Village, because there was no real reason to piss Itachi off. Like, going afterwards or before Itachi died didn't really matter to Obito achieving his plans, and since waiting is a safe thing to do, Obito just chose to do that. So while I don't think this establishes that Itachi is stronger than Obito, it does sort of establish the narrative that Itachi is a competent threat.
Yes, and this is somewhat corroborated if you go into the novels. Again, most people have heard this. I'm not going to sit here and just pretend that this is new information, but we have the whole scene where Itachi and Obito are facing each other down, and Obito remarks, "Could you kill me?" Obito responds, "It's not a matter of whether or not I could, I will kill you." And silence envelops them. There's no bloodlust in either of these auras, but the two are exchanging dangerous words and acknowledge each other as opponents. I think people slap on the term relative off of this little section, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think it just kind of goes alongside what you just mentioned, where Itachi is just pretty threatening to Obito, or in the right circumstances can be perceived as a threat. In a similar matter to Pain, like, a lot of people have this notion with the top 3 of the Akatsuki that they could just no-diff each other. I think it's more along the lines of they're just extremely threatening to each other, and it would be counterintuitive for Obito to fight Pain or Itachi, as they're just assets to his plan, and for him to go against that would make no sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think to further add on to how the scene isn't really implying that Itachi could just kill Obito whenever he wants, when Obito asks Itachi if he could kill him, Itachi says, "It's not a matter of whether I could, I will kill you." And I think the first part of that is important because Itachi isn't actually considering whether or not he would be able to kill Obito. He's just saying he would find a way if he were to break the terms. And I think that this makes sense when considering Itachi's character in general, because right before this dialogue happens, you can see that one of Itachi's terms was "don't touch Sasuke." So Obito immediately trying to screw around after that, saying, "Well, could you really stop me if I decide to break the terms?" It's obvious that Itachi would immediately follow up with a threat, because Obito is kind of indirectly threatening Sasuke when he says that, who Itachi is obviously very protective over.
I 100% agree. So I think when you kind of look at the narrative surrounding the two and the novel statements, because they're actually not that much. I think people paint these two as like these pseudo rivals when in actuality there isn't that much that really links them, or there isn't as many scenes as maybe something like Pain or something to that extent. You kind of have to get into, okay, well, what's a live Itachi's state and how does he necessarily compare maybe to his Edo Tensei counterparts? This is a big point of contention. One of the things I like to bring up is it's unclear when Kabuto obtained the genetic material for Itachi, although he is using Itachi's corpse. The best interpretation for Itachi, in my opinion, is to just say he has his Edo self stats with declining stamina and health conditions and can't last or maintain that in combat. As for example, Itachi has his dojutsu diminished, or his eyes are pretty much blind by the end of his fight with Sasuke. Yet as an Edo Tensei, he's revived at full power with his MS, which is something that's just kind of done with Uchiha bearers. It seems that the Edo Tensei just kind of revives these individuals with their peak dojutsu in a similar manner how Madara and Nagato both didn't have their Rinnegan when they died, yet were revived with it. Although in Madara's case, his corpse was tampered with, so maybe you can just kind of cut some slack there. It's unlikely that Kabuto just gave the Rinnegan to Madara's corpse or even had it in the first place. So when you look at that, it's kind of dubious. So I think if you just go off the best interpretation that Sick Itachi is Edo Itachi stats with declining stamina and health, I think it's fine for the video. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I would say in general, if you want to give Itachi the benefit of the doubt, I do agree that it's fine to say, okay, he might have the stats of his Edo Tensei self at the very beginning, but it will be on a decline as the battle continues. Especially since we see that when Edo Itachi fights, he doesn't really have any of the same drawbacks that a live Itachi does, likely due to his Edo Tensei regeneration. So even if you say they have the same stats at the beginning, the more Itachi uses ninjutsu and the longer the fight goes, the larger the disparity will look like between his alive self stats and that of his Edo Tensei, which means that he might be able to do this at the very beginning and maybe fight at those like KCM 1 level speeds, but it's not going to last very long.
And this also gets into Obito stats in comparison. Most people have heard this if you're on my channel, or Virtue has sung a similar song. In order to fight Obito, Naruto requires a power much greater than that he could typically or already possessed against Pain. Now, Minato doesn't outright state this, but it is somewhat implied, and Kurama does back this up later on in the war that this is in reference to KCM2. Now, if you're of the opinion that KCM2 puts, Naruto a tier above Obito or an exact range, and you think Orange Mask Obito is just that strong, I can't really tell you how to interpret that. More so that these narratives do exist and do put his higher ends on a similar level or a little bit beyond that of Itachi's, honestly speaking.
Yeah, I think this is likely referring to KCM2, essentially implying that Naruto needs KCM2 to defeat Obito. Obviously, this doesn't mean that Obito's as strong as KCM2 Naruto. In fact, I would disagree with that and say Obito only becomes like super comparable to KCM2 once he obtains the Rinnegan. And before that, I would say he's in between KCM2 and KCM1 Naruto, since KCM2 is what's required to beat him. I think another thing that really helps out Obito stat-wise is if you argue when Naruto's describing Minato's mental state to the Raikage and Tsunade, he actually says that in Minato's mind, the only person who could beat Obito is Naruto with Kurama. So if you take that statement into account, it would essentially imply that Obito is stronger than the 10 years younger Hiruzen, who was just somewhat combating the Nine Tails in the village and holding him back. And even though Hiruzen obviously had help, Minato states that he's specifically entrusting Hiruzen to restrain the Nine Tails. So I think he was actually doing most of the work of all those Leaf Ninja, which is important because Kurama was directly compared to base Hashirama's Wood Golem in the 4th data book. So if you argue that like Obito scales above this Hiruzen, it puts him in a crazy tax bracket, and stat-wise, I would argue puts him above Itachi as well.
So when you look at it, Obito generally does have higher end interpretations, whereas for Itachi, you do have to make some leaps. Like, I know some people are under the interpretation, okay, let's say you think a live Itachi is directly the same as his Edo Tensei counterpart, and then you have Edo Itachi, who's on the same level as an initial EMS Sasuke, who potentially goes to get stronger as he's more emotionally charged, gets more hatred amps off of learning new information and discovering more about the Uchiha clan, and just dealing with his feelings around Konoha and Itachi as a whole. That could potentially extend to higher versions of Kurama's chakra, but I think this is a bit of a slippery slope and much less solid than the established narrative surrounding Obito. And it's even unclear if that version of Naruto that EMS Sasuke fights alongside is even stronger than the initial KCM2 that Obito is compared to. Like, that's a topic in of itself. So it is a bit dubious, but we generally lean towards Obito having potentially higher stat interpretations. The next segment we have is, and again, most people probably expected this, is the scene where Obito gets hit with a Matarasu. Now, we do have to reverse engineer this, and I'm going to say this. I'm going to start off with this. If you argue Izanagi or Kamui, both interpretations work in this scene, right? Both of them can be argued, and both of them can actually work with everything that happens in this scene. It's more so up to you with the evidence presented and how you feel about it and which interpretation you go with that kind of dictates some later points. Like, so let's get into it. Starting off, let's talk about the Izanagi interpretation. One of the big points that people bring up with Izanagi is the Data Book 3 statement, which somewhat implies it's in reference to Kamui, with the diction it uses vanish through the air itself as though it transcends into space. Now, you almost have to take the data books with Obito with a grain of salt, as they are somewhat flawed, as they do mention Obito as Madara, also mentioning that he's still injured from his fight with Hashirama, as noted in Fan Book 2. So they are still somewhat playing into the idea that Obito is Madara, and do keep the diction somewhat vague surrounding Obito. So I do understand people's fascination with the Data Book 3 point, but I wouldn't personally use it as an end-all be-all for this discussion. Do you wanna tap in here?
Especially since I do think the statements in Data Book 3 actually get called into question later on, because even though the statement like transcends into space makes it sound like Kamui definitively, there's actually a statement later in the Naruto Stealth volume, which, if you didn't know, is like a guidebook released alongside volume 61 of Naruto for the Road to Ninja movie, which a good chunk of it is canon because it's just recapping the manga. And in that guidebook, there's a statement specifically pointing to Obito using Izanagi against Konan, which says, "A being without a physical form, transcending space and time. Its true nature, abilities, and everything about it are completely unfathomable, a mysterious existence." Now, I'm sure you caught on to this. It's stated that Obito transcended space specifically in reference to Izanagi. So even though the Data Book 3 statement does imply it's Kamui, the same language was used right after that in the Road to Ninja guide, which describes the exact same scene, which calls everything into question. And maybe transcending into space isn't something that can only refer to Kamui if other guidebooks are using the same language to refer to Izanagi. So I think that if you just go off of statements, there's no real definitive way to tell what Obito used, which is why I think it's more important to look at practically, could he have used Izanagi or could he have used Kamui, by just analyzing how the abilities work in general, rather than trying to go off of statements.
I agree with that 100%. Now, I think the biggest obstacle with the Izanagi interpretation is that the argument for Izanagi assumes Obito set Izanagi in advance. And I have this problem with people. I don't know where it got lost in the Naruto community. You can use the jutsu whenever, and it just rewrites everything. The way it functions is Izanagi has to be activated in advance. It's a jutsu that, like, this is a big point in the Danzo fight, is that he has to reactivate Izanagi before Sasuke's arrow hits him, otherwise the damage done would have stayed. And this is a point in Obito vs. Conan. He doesn't regen the damage that he took before he used Izanagi. He still has an arm missing. Same thing with Danzo. He gets cut on the shoulder by Sasuke's Susanoo aura, or the finger of the Susanoo, and then he retains that cut and uses it to summon the Baku right after. So you do retain the damage when you use Izanagi, and it has to be set up in advance.
Yeah, I think the idea that Obito set up the Izanagi in advance is just very flawed, since we know from both the databook entry for Izanagi and Danzo's use of it when fighting Sasuke that you need to weave hand seals in order to activate Izanagi, and we could see throughout Obito's entire conversation with Sasuke, he was not wielding hand seals, so he just couldn't have activated it unless you argue that Obito can somehow activate Izanagi without hand seals, which we have never seen before in the manga. And there's also the fact that Danzo did go out of his way to uncover his eye to use, or when he reawakened Shisui's Sharingan, which is important because we know from the example when Danzo Genjutsu Mifune that he doesn't need to uncover his eye in order to use Kodo Matsukami, which sort of implies that in order for him to have thought he needed to uncover his eye, he needed to do it for Izanagi, which makes things even worse because we see that during Obito's entire conversation with Sasuke, his eye was covered.
And this extends to Obito because in his fight with Conan, he breaks the side of the mask that he uses the Izanagi eye on. So it directly follows the Danzo Obito train or line of reasoning where they need to uncover that eye to actually utilize Izanagi. And like you mentioned, he doesn't have an opportunity to do that. So again, you almost have to assume he did it prior, which is an assumption you have to make in terms of the Izanagi argument. I think it does work, and I think you can make it, but you know, I just do want to note that you do have to assert that it did happen prior and not during or like sometime before the Amaterasu hit Sasuke or Obito maybe sensed it. Like it had to have been before Obito walked out to see Sasuke. For the Kamui interpretation, this is a little different now because I think we're both of the opinion that Obito actually did get tagged here. He just was blatantly off guard and was materialized in this instance when he was grabbing his mask and actually did get Amaterasu flames on him. So the first point is the Amaterasu, right? The big thing you'd probably bring up is, well, the Amaterasu should have burned through Obito's clothing. While this is true, we do have examples of Amaterasu having an extremely long burn time, especially when you're not the primary target, which Obito's shoulder was not the primary target. That was Obito's eye, as the jutsu was said to activate when Obito's Sharingan met with Sasuke's eye. So we have the example with Karin where the Amaterasu she was hit with doesn't even fully burn through her clothing and damage her really by the time Sasuke actually undoes the Amaterasu on her. So you already have one example. Okay, it takes a moment to activate there. Another example you could potentially have is the samurai example in the 5 Kage Summit, where the samurai are able to be on, like, they're on fire with the Amaterasu for a prolonged period of time, and Kankuro is able to take the armor off them, and the samurai still aren't damaged underneath. So you have another example there. A third one I would bring up is the Raikage's arm in the 5 Kage Summit, and how it's on fire for a prolonged period of time, and even when he chops it off, you just see that the arm is on fire, yet no skin has been torn through. It's just, you know, there, like the Amaterasu hasn't even breached the skin. And for my fourth example, I would just bring up how when Itachi shoots the Amaterasu at Sasuke and it hits the trees in the background that aren't the primary target, the trees are still on fire the entire time and it still hasn't burned through the trees. So it seems the most consistent interpretation is that it takes longer for the Amaterasu to burn when the primary target isn't, you know, actually hit.
So we know that just because Obito's clothes remained unscathed, it doesn't really mean that the Amaterasu, or that he couldn't have used Kamui and it had to be Izanagi. Now, the one debunk people might use for Kamui is the idea that maybe Obito can't phase through things that are already touching him, and since the Amaterasu landed, he had to have used Izanagi. But I would make the argument that Obito can actually just phase through things that are already touching him, because we do see him do it on multiple occasions. The first of which being when he fights Konan, she lands paper bombs on his legs, and you can very clearly see that it's directly on his leg. But then when he goes to phase, they just pass right through him. So we know that he can phase through objects that are already touching him. And another example of this is when he's hit with Shino's bugs. I think this one's even more blatant because you could see the bugs are completely surrounding him to the point where he's not even visible, yet they just suddenly collapse inwards and Obito is missing, which clearly indicates that he was phasing through the bugs that were already touching him. So if we've already established that Obito can phase through objects that are already attached to him, it doesn't really make sense for Amaterasu to be one specific exception to this clear rule. Like, Amaterasu does burn forever, but we know that, like, it shouldn't have any other properties that allow it to somehow resist Obito phasing when he's been shown to do it to other objects. And I think the nail in the coffin for why Obito likely used Kamui to phase through Amaterasu is actually the second fan book, which notes that Obito can phase through all ninjutsu and taijutsu, which is pretty self-explanatory since Amaterasu is a ninjutsu, And since Obito can phase through all ninjutsu, he can also phase through Amaterasu.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I like how you mentioned it. It's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, the third data book page for the Amaterasu Seal Trap quite literally lists it as a ninjutsu, so it's pretty hard to argue against. And I think the scene still works if Obito actually just does Kamui after the fact. It just lets the Amaterasu phase through him and then maybe or just sucks it up or something to that extent. It's pretty consistent. Like, there's no real reason he couldn't have done Kamui here. And this is what I was kind of alluding to before. Both interpretations do work. You can make a case for both interpretations. It's just that, in our opinion, the Kamui one requires less of an assumption than the Izanagi one, which requires an assumption that he prepped Izanagi before, which somewhat juxtapose the scene of him getting caught off guard. Like, it's weird to suggest he prepped Izanagi expecting Itachi to do something and then also just gets hit with a Amaterasu and is surprised by it. You know what I'm saying? Like, they don't really flow as well together. So I think this is pretty consistent. And even the third data book page that notes there is no jutsu to escape its fury, I would argue or the second fan book takes precedent over that, as it comes at a later point in the series, which is usually how Naruto functions with its lore / scaling. Things that come later usually take precedent as they recontextualize everything that comes before, or can recontextualize it. Itachi himself being an example of this in the statements made about him. So I think him comboing here is a perfectly acceptable interpretation. I think everything fits. The only little caveat here, I guess you could say, is Obito screaming, but I never really saw this as an outright debunk. You can make it for the Izanagi interpretation that he's just screaming and he got hit. I think that's fine. For the Kamui interpretation, I personally argued that he just wants to control Sasuke and is luring Sasuke in with the false sense of security that Amaterasu can't actually damage him. We know this isn't just conjecture, as he notes directly before the 5 Kage Summit that he wants to control Sasuke and have him sync up with the Geto Mazo. So him doing this is very in character, and he is an actor in character as well. He literally acted as Toby. So I don't think him screaming and pretending to die to an attack is far beneath him. But if you were under the idea that he actually did get tagged and is in pain here, I think that could also be a case. But I also do think that is somewhat contradictory to the Amaterasu burning slowly when it's not the primary target.
So the only real controversial part after this is Obito's statement right afterwards saying if Itachi knew his secrets, he would be dead. Because this is a very vague statement, and you could almost put any narrative to it, with the common consistency being, okay, there is a universe where if Itachi knew something about Obito, he would have died there. Now, we both have slightly different interpretations of it. I think, TG, do you want to explain yours first?
Yeah. So we were discussing this and we were discussing possible interpretations. One I brought up is that Obito's I would be dead could be in reference to Tsukuyomi, as the jutsu in question was meant to activate upon eye contact with Obito's eye. Itachi not knowing everything would be in reference to Obito phasing through Amaterasu or possible ninjutsu. And the Genjutsu would be something that he couldn't phase through, which is, again, further supported by the second fan book, where he can't phase through Genjutsu, obviously. So this would be a situation where Obito would be looking at Sasuke's eye and be exposed to Tsukuyomi, which could have killed him. Hence, I would be dead. That's one interpretation I brought up, as that is one Mangekyo ability Itachi could have potentially sealed in Sasuke's eye along with Amaterasu. I like your interpretation as well. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so when I initially read this, the way I interpreted it was if Itachi knew that Amaterasu wouldn't work ahead of time, instead of trying to implant a ninjutsu to catch Obito off guard, I think he might have just tried to assassinate Obito before his fight with Sasuke. So in this scenario, Obito might just think that Itachi could successfully catch him off guard while he's sleeping or in some other scenario and assassinate him before his fight with Sasuke, which Itachi would probably opt to do if he knew that his Amaterasu plan wouldn't work.
Yes. So there are multiple interpretations to this statement. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it isn't vague. These were the ones that seem the most relevant to me. Maybe you guys have a different interpretation down below. I'd love to hear it. But again, it could really be anything, and it's predetermined on whatever interpretation you have with Izanagi versus Kamui, obviously. So we're just throwing some impossible interpretations out for the Kamui side. But the bottom line is, all of this is only relevant if Obito stands materialized in front of Itachi, which he would never do realistically, as Kamui is passive in nature, which is also why we think Obito is physically materialized here. And if you argue it works on reactions, I also doesn't think that works, since Obito can use Kamui versus Ten Tails Madara. Pre-absorbing Sage Chakra, he's obviously not as strong or as fast as Sage Madara. Pretty much spells it out for itself.
So the point is that Itachi can't end this fight immediately with an Amaterasu, because Obito would probably be able to phase through it, which means that as the fight goes on, I think a big problem Itachi is going to have is his stamina. Don't get me wrong, I think Itachi's stamina is actually downplayed quite a bit in the community. Like, people act like he can only fire 2 ninjutsu and then he's out of the fight. Yeah. But we see that he did just outlast Heavy Sasuke. Sasuke ran out of stamina first. So in general, I don't think his stamina is bad, because Sasuke does have a lot of chakra. But I think the problem against Obito won't actually be Itachi completely running out of chakra. It'll be the drawbacks from his MS abilities. We see that even though Itachi did outlast Sasuke overall, there were still multiple points in the fight where Itachi falls to his knees and starts coughing up blood. Sure, you can argue that Itachi was holding back in general, but I don't think he was holding back during these moments unless you think he could somehow fake coughing up blood, which I think is a massive stretch. So we do know that once Itachi starts to try to use his MS abilities, there will likely be multiple moments where he will fall to his knees and start coughing up blood. And to be honest, if he does this even once against Obito, I do think Obito is just going to come up from behind him and immediately suck him into the Kamui dimension. So you're kind of in a scenario where Itachi can only use his MS abilities very sparingly, or else he'll fall to his knees, at which point Obito will completely take advantage of his bad stamina and get him in the Kamui dimension successfully.
And when you're looking at the abilities, one of the things we discovered when we were scripting this video is that we know from the series that Amaterasu could be reacted to / dealt with. We see Gyuki outright react to Amaterasu with his sensory abilities, but something we came across that was really interesting is that Danzo himself also reacts to Sasuke's Amaterasu, which is very interesting. So if you actually look at the scene, Danzo's jumping back and has an exclamation point after Sasuke uses Amaterasu and raises his arm when the Amaterasu actually hits. And you actually see him in the air and his elbow is cocked back. So he actually does have the feat of reacting to Sasuke's Amaterasu, which this is kind of interesting because Danzo doesn't have his Sharingan active here. It's on cooldown and we see the eye is like whited out when he gets it back. So it more so has to fall on his Hashirama cells, which do offer a sensory or a passive sensory boost, as noted with Hashirama, or has noted with Madara, who notes this when talking to Kabuto. That's why I can see what's coming so well, which if you extend this to Obito, who has more of Hashirama's tissue, may actually lead to the idea that, okay, he may just have a pretty good chance of just sensing Amaterasu and not getting tagged by it as well, on top of the passive phasing. If a far inferior amount of sensory could enable Danzo to do it, Obito may actually be in a higher stage to do it, which Obito's reactions are there. He outright reacts to Kakashi's Kamui in the 5 Kage Summit. I know some people like to argue he didn't, but the Kana is on screen, and the Genjutsu or the Jutsu has been initiated. So I do think it is a legit reaction feat. If you want to paint Obito as being like Fu and Torne level, I'm not going to lie. You can either argue he's holding back, which I think is likely since he puts them under Genjutsu, or in all actuality, he's just not going all out, or probably isn't going all out, unless you think that Fu and Torne can also just intercept Kakashi's Kamui, which I'm not of the opinion of. So it seems likely that Obito would just be fine with dealing with things like Amaterasu, just due to all these factors.
Amaterasu shouldn't be a major problem for Obito, just because, as we've already established, I think it's more likely that even if Obito is hit, he could just phase through it. And like you mentioned, Danzo reacting to Sasuke's Amaterasu was just really funny when we first noticed it. And it does sort of imply that since Danzo and Sasuke are physically relative, yet Danzo can still react to his Amaterasu, it sort of gives the implication that as long as you're relative to the caster of the Amaterasu in terms of physical speed, you should be able to at least somewhat react to their Amaterasu as well, which makes sense because we see Naruto also react to Sasuke's Amaterasu in the Final Valley, and there is just a consistency where if two characters are on the same tier, the Uchiha's Amaterasu won't outright blitz the other guy that they're fighting against.
That's more in line with Sasuke's Susanoo arrow, which blitzed Danzo's physicals, to add into that.
Yeah. So I would say in general, Obito should at the very least, even if he's not fast enough to dodge the Amaterasu, he should be fast enough to make himself intangible before the Amaterasu hits him. I think that's the bare minimum interpretation you have to have, which makes Amaterasu a non-issue. Now, I think this is where we start to get into Itachi's other arsenal, because he does have a pretty deep bag of abilities, and specifically something that's interesting to talk about is the Totsuka Blade and Yatamir that he possesses. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I see a lot of people just due to the Itachi spirit weapons are pretty ridiculous. Someone like Black Zetsu notes that they make Itachi invincible. This is not new arguments to you guys. Like, you guys know what I'm talking about. Black Zetsu, Kaguya's will, notes Itachi with these weapons is invincible. The Yatamir obviously is able to pretty much change or adapt its properties to any oncoming attack. We have the Totsuka Blade, which is imbued with a sealing jutsu to whoever it pierces and sends them to a drunken genjutsu world. Now, a lot of people try and argue that these abilities, or do argue that these abilities would work on Obito, since they're noted to work on people, material, or astral body, ninjutsu, or physical, lose their meaning in reference to these abilities. However, I think it is a bit of a stretch to actually say that, for example, the Totsuka Blade would work on Obito, since his body part is just getting sent to another time space. The idea, or the logic I use is, it would be like arguing Itachi's in the ice dimension, Kaguya goes into the lava dimension, Itachi's Totsuka Blade can just hit Kaguya from there. It would not be able to reach into another time space, at least in my opinion. You know what I mean? There's nothing really to suggest that, nor does Obito necessarily fall into this like category.
Yeah, I agree. And as for the Yatamir, it is a little weird whether or not Obito could just like phase directly through it. But at the very least, I think that Obito should be able to teleport to the inside of the Susanoo just using his warping ability, which means that if he's at the inside of the Susanoo, then Itachi might start having some trouble because he's already taking the backlash from the Susanoo, and then Obito's right in front of him ready to throw hands. Things could start going very downhill from that point if Itachi isn't capable of taking him out, since Itachi's stamina will just be depleting like I already said. And it just gives Obito more and more opportunities to suck Itachi into the Kamui dimension. The only qualifying statement I'll make for like one counter Itachi might have to getting sucked into the Kamui dimension is actually swapping himself out with an exploding shadow clone. Do you want to get more into that?
Yeah, I think the exploding shadow clone argument is a little, I'm not going to lie, overrated. Now, I don't have a problem with it fundamentally, right? I think it's a fine case, especially since Obito, can be fallible. I think if he sucks in a shadow clone, it's entirely fine. I think the bigger issue is that we just don't have a metric of how strong the exploding shadow clone is. All we know is that Kakashi took quite a bit of damage from it in part 1, to the point that his entire back is grazed and you hear a cracking noise, maybe implying bone damage from the blast or some internal damage that we don't see. But the problem is that A, you can obviously argue Itachi's holding back in this instance, but B, we have no higher end metric for the exploding shadow clone, whereas we do have higher end metrics for Obito's durability, which make it a lot harder to just use to say, okay, it's gonna blow off Obito's arm in a similar manner to Conan's paper bombs. Like, there's nothing to necessarily link all the paper bombs that Obito sucked in to Itachi's exploding shadow clone. There's no way to just correlate the two or like make that, correlation, aside from the fact that they're both things that go boom. You know what I mean? There's no real distinction AP wise. Although I will admit, in Naruto, blasts are generally effective. Even Kakuzu, someone who's renowned for his durability, at least in Diamond Morph, does actually go out of his way to Diamond Morph basic paper bombs.
I do think the whole exploding shadow clone win con is a little weird, although I do think that if we're in scenarios where Itachi's winning, the exploding shadow clone is probably one of his best shots, with the other one being Tsukuyomi. Now this is a little weird because I'm not gonna lie, if Obito gets caught in Tsukuyomi, the fight might just be over. We've just never seen Obito break out of a genjutsu that strong.
Yeah.
I know Sasuke broke out of it, and it's confirmed in the third data book that he did actually bust out of the Tsukuyomi. It's legitimate. It's not like Itachi just dropped the genjutsu. But then we kind of get into the question of, okay, was Itachi really going all out with the Tsukuyomi? Because just because Sasuke broke out of the Tsukuyomi doesn't mean Itachi was actually going all out with the genjutsu, which makes the whole thing super vague, and it calls into question whether or not Obito could actually break out of it. What do you think about that? Could Obito actually break out of Tsukuyomi?
Yeah, I think this is definitely the most dubious part of Obito's arsenal because he has good Genjutsu and the Sharingan is designed to deal with Genjutsu defensively, but there are limits to this, obviously. I think one of the better ways you can maybe look at it is Itachi says like only a Sharingan or a Mangekyo Sharingan could defend against Tsukiyomi, so maybe you can say Obito has that potential to do that. However, again, Obito's Genjutsu feats, especially defensively, we just don't know. The Genjutsu offensively and defensively are two very different things. For example, you have someone like C who's a Genjutsu specialist, but defensively, he's super weak to Genjutsu. Same thing with Kurenai, although they can break each other out or they can break through such Genjutsu or be broken out. So it's kind of weird to discuss. Honestly speaking, we just haven't seen even though I think you can make the case Obito may have better offensive Genjutsu off his Kurama controlling feats. I think defensively, it's a bit more to be desired, and we just haven't seen the feats to just objectively say, yeah, he could shrug out or break through Tsukiyomi. Honestly speaking, a lot of this is kind of based on that initial interaction with Izanagi or Kamui, honestly. As if you think Itachi just straight up blitzed Obito with the Amaterasu, then the rest of this discussion falls apart. Or if you maybe think Obito is materialized and off guard, there's more to that. Or if he used Kamui. So we can't really just sit here and tell you what to think, more so just offer these different interpretations. I do think Obito winning more often than not is the consistent interpretation, especially looking at him as a whole. This isn't even factoring into what if he actually did use Izanagi in an offensive fight with Itachi, which does kind of secure a GG as Mangekyo Sharingan users can't really sense Izanagi respawn. So I think the Obito side is the more consistent one, but honestly speaking, there's just so many presupposed points and there's only so many interpretations we can cover compared to like we can only say so much. At the end of the day, if you think like Itachi blitzed Obito with that Amaterasu past his passive Kamui, or maybe you don't think it's passive, we can't really tell you anything about it. So I think this was just our 2 cents in the matchup. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I will just say Itachi's biggest enemy here is really his own stamina. Like if this was Edo Itachi, I actually think the conversation becomes much better because then he can use his MS abilities without creating openings for himself that Obito can exploit. But in this scenario, the reality is that Itachi can only use like 2 or 3 Mangekyo Jutsu before he starts to fall to his knees and cough up blood, at which point Obito can take him down. And I think that is the most relevant point here. Because Itachi may be on that level of combatant, especially if you think he scales to his Edo self and will be fighting at that level in the beginning of the fight. But he's just going to slowly decline until eventually he leaves a wide enough opening for Obito to take advantage of. Which I do think is how this fight would play out more times than not, even though some of Itachi's arguments are pretty solid.
Yes, I agree. So that's the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Go check out Cameron. Again, we're going to be doing Obito vs. Pain on his channel. That came out very good. I think you guys are going to be interested on this. Let me know your guys' thoughts down below. I know, no, there's no winning with this upload, but I mean, it is what it is. I just want to talk about it. And I think we had a couple new points that maybe people hadn't heard or some differing interpretations maybe people hadn't come across. So hopefully we were able to add at least one new thing to this discussion. If I did, or we did, leave a like below. But yeah, that's the video. Thank you for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me.
I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.